weather, and I'm sorry for that. And sorry for the people that are inconvenienced by it. Miss Dimple hurts a lot during that, but she's here tonight, isn't she? Teaching her class, like always. Matthew 14, last week we talked about the feeding of the 5,000 and drew some lessons from that. Tonight I want us to look at the last part of the chapter, Jesus walking on the water, and try to draw some lessons from that as well. Beginning in verse 23, we read, "And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up into a mountain apart to pray. And when the evening was come, he was there alone. But the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went unto them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, It is a spirit. And they cried out for fear. But straightway Jesus spoke unto them, saying, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it be thou, bid me come unto thee on the water. And he said, Come. And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him and said unto him, O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? And when they were come into the ship, the wind ceased. Then they that were in the ship came and worshipped him, saying, Of a truth thou art the Son of God. And then when they were gone over, they came into the land of Gennesaret, and when the men of that place had knowledge of him, they sent out into all the country round about, and brought unto him all that were diseased, and besought him that they might only touch the hem of his garment, and as many as touched were made perfectly whole. The feeding of the 5,000 was a great miracle that drew a lot of attention to Jesus. Those who were there and were fed by him on that occasion recognized that he was indeed the Messiah. And John's record shows that they began to contemplate forcing him to become their king. And this led Jesus to send the disciples away, and the disciples may have engaged in that or been involved with them, because you'll remember that they had a mistaken view, even following Jesus' resurrection, about the nature of the kingdom. They asked him, Will you at this time restore again the kingdom to Israel? So it was evident that they still had some hang-ups about the type of kingdom it was going to be. So Jesus sent the disciples away first, and then he sent the multitudes away. In fact, the record states that he made the disciples leave. And the word that is used denotes that he had to just demand of them that they leave. They were to get into a ship and go to the other side. In the miracle of the 5,000, we learned that Jesus had the power to satisfy those who were physically hungry. I don't think anybody left there that day hungry. We talked about the fragments being taken up, the broken pieces being taken up, 12 baskets full. He has the power, or had the power, to satisfy their hunger, and he has the power to satisfy one's thirst. We know that he said in Matthew 5, verse 6, Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. He has the ability to satisfy our spiritual hunger and thirst as well, doesn't he? Peter said, desire the sincere milk of the word that you may grow thereby. 1 Peter 2:2. And in John 4, Jesus told the woman at the well that I have water that you will be able to drink and you will never be thirsty again. So Jesus has the power had the power as he did these miracles to take care of people's physical hunger and thirst. He has the power to satisfy our spiritual hunger and thirst. I was talking about Jesus asking the disciples to get into the boat and leave. The word that is used is constrained. I believe the New American Standard Version says he made his disciples. You know, sometimes your parents would make you do things that you really didn't want to do, but they had ways of encouraging you to do them. We don't know exactly what all Jesus did and said, but he was urging the disciples to depart hastily and to get into the boat and go to the other side.
This has a reference to the word compelled.
Compelled. Yeah, he compelled. So that's the idea in the original language, we're told, that he did compel them to go. He did not want the people, evidently, to be encouraged by them or anybody else to try to force him to become a king, because he said, my kingdom is not of what? Not of this world. It wasn't going to be an earthly kingdom. And he was having a difficult time getting the people to accept that. A lot of the Jewish rabbis and other people, common people, thought that the Old Testament scriptures were pointing to a material kingdom and that he was going to have to do that. So Jesus sent them away, and then what did he do? He went into the mountains alone to pray. And Jesus often resorted to such places for prayer. He prayed on the mountain. He prayed in a garden. He evidently spent a great deal of time, what some would say his resting time. My sister and I were talking just the other day about how our mom would always say, well, let's do this while we're resting. Jesus would teach, preach all day long, be with the multitudes, be, intermingling with them and be doing miracles and so on. The people at the last of the chapter, they're people just mobbing him. They're bringing people in from the countryside to be healed by him. And you can imagine, he was God, yes, but he was also a man. He had a physical body. He was God in the flesh. And the flesh is easily tired, especially when you're under stressful situations. And it's evident that Jesus had the ability to be burdened and to be stressed just like we are. If he hadn't, then there would have been no way he could identify with us and the things through which we go. But he was tempted in all points like as are we, yet without sin. And he was under intense emotional stress at times. As we read about him in the garden, it's been debated whether he actually sweat blood. There have been those who have said that yes, that can be done. It is possible for a person to actually sweat blood. But the account says that he sweat as it were great drops of blood. But we know that he experienced all of those things that we go through And that's the reason that he is qualified to be our mediator and one to make intercession for us at the throne of God, because he knows what it's like to live upon this earth and to go through with all these things. This present miracle, walking on the sea, demonstrates Jesus' command over his creation. Colossians 1 tells us that Jesus was involved in the creation. You go back to Genesis 1 and you have the statement, let us, and it's plural in the original language there, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And so, obviously, the Godhead was involved in the creation. And Jesus in particular is said to have been involved in it, in that passage in Colossians 1. So it was his creation, and he demonstrates his command over that. Sometimes people say, well, Jesus was just walking out on the sand near the seashore where the water was just a, couple of inches deep, maybe 6 inches at the most. And, or maybe there was a bar running out into the sea there. But that won't stand up, because we're told that they were in the midst of the sea. And the original language literally says that there's about, let me see, I've got a note here somewhere that I wrote down. Many stadia. A stadia is, if authorities are right about it, about 607 feet. And John tells us that it was a considerable distance. And some estimate that it was maybe 3 miles or more from shore. So he wasn't walking on a sandbar. That would not have been likely at all. Probably you've all heard the story about 2 fellows who took a young guy fishing with them, and they pushed their boat out from the bank and got a little ways offshore. And one of them said, I forgot my tackle box. And he jumped out of the boat and just walked right over there and got his tackle box and came back. And another one said, well, I forgot my container of coffee. And so he jumped out of the boat and took off over there and came back. Well, that new fella, not to be outdone, said, well, I forgot whatever. He jumped out and just went in under head and ears. The other 2 looked at one another, and one of them said, if we don't show him where those stumps are, he'll drown. But there were no stumps for Jesus to walk on. He walked on the water. And it was so evident and so real that, the apostles thought that he was a ghost, an apparition, a spirit being. And Peter, of course, would walk on the water too. And he began to sink because of fear. And, of course, Jesus rebuked him for his lack of faith. And I was reminded that Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 5:7, we walk by faith, not by sight. We walk by faith, not by sight. And so it is that we can overcome our fears if we will just walk by faith. Here's some lessons that I want us to draw from this series tonight, or this particular passage tonight. Number 1 is the importance of prayer. Jesus was a man of prayer. Daniel, we're told, prayed 3 times daily with his face toward Jerusalem. And what better thing to do than to pray in the morning, at noontime, and the evening. We should pray when we arise. We should pray before we go to bed. We ought to be a people of prayer. When there's a need that arises, we need to pray at all times or any time during the day. I know occasionally here at the building we'll get a call and someone will say, You know, we have a sick family member. Would you guys say a prayer for them? Would you have it announced or whatever? I try to always pray when I hang up the phone. That's a good time to do it while it's fresh on your mind. And we need to be a people who do that. We need to pray regularly. We had a call one time from someone that didn't even give their name. The lady said that she had 2 sons and they were going through very, very difficult times. You know, please pray for them. We don't have to know their names to pray for them, so we prayed for them. We announced it. And I'm sure that a lot of you prayed for that family as well. In Luke 18:1, Jesus taught a parable that men ought always to do what? Always should pray and not faint. That is, not give up, not quit. Pray. Don't faint. 1 Thessalonians 5:17. Who can quote it? Pray without ceasing. Pray without ceasing. Does that mean that we have to spend every waking moment on our knees, talking audibly? No, that's not what it means, does it? But it means to be steadfast in prayer, to do it consistently, like Daniel did, every day. You'll remember when they made that ordinance that he was not to worship any other god. Daniel went right ahead doing what he had always been doing, but he didn't do it out of rebellion, did he? He didn't do it saying, I'll show you. I can be just as stubborn as you can. I'm going to do it whether you make a law against it or not. Well, the thing about it was Daniel had already been doing it when there was no law. But when the law was passed that he was not supposed to do that, he remembered exactly what the apostles said. We ought to obey God rather than man. And that's what he did. In Romans 12:12, Paul says basically the same thing that he wrote in 1 Thessalonians 5:17. He says, continuing instant in prayer. The idea there is pray without ceasing. You keep on praying. There was a man many years ago who told me, he talked to me several times through the years, and he would always begin the conversation with these words, Edward, I have trouble praying. And it really bothered him. I would talk to him and encourage him and try to help him to see that none of us were worthy to approach the throne of God. But we've been given that privilege because of Jesus coming and presenting himself as a sacrifice and atonement for our sins. And so we have that opportunity, and we should consider it to be a very precious one. But, you know, we may not always be able to know exactly for what we should pray. But our Heavenly Father understands. And so we need to do the best we can. And it's a whole lot like other things too. The more you do it, then the better you are at it. So we need to get in the practice of praying. Where do you pray? Well, you don't pray to be seen of men, but you shouldn't be afraid to pray in maybe a public place or whatever. I remember I knew a lady who was going through a difficult time in her life, and she met a gospel preacher that she had known for many, many years as she was coming out, I believe, and he was going into Kroger's. And he asked her how she was doing. She told him some of the difficulties she was going through with, and as she got ready to walk off, she said, just keep me in your prayers. He said, let's pray right now. And they had a prayer together right there at the entrance to Kroger's. And, you know, I don't think God will hold that against him or her for praying and say you were praying to be seen of men. No, that wasn't the purpose at all, because he was genuinely concerned, and so he had a prayer with her. There's nothing wrong with that. But if we think we'll be heard for much speaking and that we'll make an impression on people by getting out and praying in public and hollering and carrying on like one fellow used to do on the square in Gainesboro. Don't know if Johnny and Susan ever saw him or not, but I did. My brother's and sister-in-law's store was just right there on the corner, and he would come in sometimes on Saturday afternoon, and you could hear him, and he would fall down face first. And I'm not saying that he wasn't sincere, but then you could hear him pretty much all over town. And I thought about those passages then. The importance of prayer, remember that. From this section, let's learn also that life has its perils, P-E-R-I-L-S. Notice that the disciples struggled against contrary winds. The winds were contrary to them. They weren't blowing in the direction they needed to blow. And so you will have that to happen to you in life. I believe it's Mark's account that mentions the oars that they were using to send the boat across the lake. And they were straining at the oars. They weren't making any progress because the winds were contrary to them. Life is filled with contrary winds. You ask people sometimes, how are things going? Well, not good. You know, they have problems and difficulties in life. Man born of a woman is a few days and full of trouble, Job said in Job 14:1. And that same passage, Romans 12:12, that mentions prayer, tells us to be patient in tribulation. That's a pretty good indication that tribulation is going to come. There's going to be some problems in life. So we have to be patient during that time. Third lesson I want us to remember is, you've heard this many times, but it bears repeating over and over and over again. Always keep your eyes on Jesus. Regardless of what's going on around you, always keep your eyes on Him. Peter evidently began looking. Maybe he had just gotten to Jesus and was maybe within reach of Him. And perhaps he thought, all is well now. But suddenly, for whatever reason, he began watching the wind of the waves tossed to and fro by the winds, and he began to sink. He was near enough that Jesus was able to reach and answer his plea when he said, Lord, save me. He was able to lift him back to his feet, and they continued into the boat. In time of temptation, we need to keep our eyes on Jesus. What did he do? Read Matthew chapter 4. He resisted the devil by quoting Scripture to him. In time of difficulty, lest you give up. It's so easy to give up when things become difficult for us. Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2. We're running with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. You know, some of you have run in marathons, and my favorite marathon is to the dinner table. That's a pretty good marathon. But, no, I've run considerable distances myself over the years. But you have to concentrate on what you're doing and remember your goal. In time of prosperity, we need to keep our eyes on Jesus because we can become proud. You know, I really like the statement, the philosophy that guided Agur, A-G-U-R, in Proverbs 30. And his request to the Lord was, you know, don't give me so little that I might be tempted to steal and take your name in vain. And don't give me so much that I would become proud and forget you. He said, I want just enough so that I'll be all right, in reference to those things. So we need to keep our eyes on him during times of prosperity. In time of poverty, lest we give in to the temptation to steal and take the name of God in vain. We need to keep our eyes on the Lord at all times. He's our example, isn't he? 1 Peter 2:21, that we should walk or follow in his footsteps. And a fourth lesson that I want us to remember is that our faith must be stronger than our doubts and our fears. You'll notice, I'd urge you sometimes to read this again and emphasize the words fear and afraid and faith. Those three words appear several times within that context that we read. And so it is that oftentimes our fears bring us down. The one-talent man had a problem with fear. I was afraid, he said. I was afraid, so I went and digged in the ground and hid that talent. And so we need always to fight our fears, to overcome them. Perfect love casts out fear. John wrote in 1 John 4, verse 18. He tells us that fear and love can't coexist, you know. And you can take a good concordance and look up the word fear, and there's several different words that are, or a few words that are translated fear. But one that we're familiar with is phobos, or phobia. That's an intense fear of one thing or another. And so that is what is needed, or not needed. We need to have love and faith, because those two things will help us to overcome. Back up just a moment to Matthew chapter 10. I made a note about this. Matthew chapter 10, beginning in verse 26. Let's see. Matthew 10, verse 26. He says, fear them not, therefore. He's talking about those who have been talking against Jesus and against his disciples and their work. He said, fear them not, therefore, for there is nothing covered that shall not be revealed, and hid that shall not be known. What I tell you in darkness, that speak you in light, and what you hear in the ear, that preach you upon the housetops. And fear not them who kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. And then he goes on to say in verse 31, after having talked about the 2 sparrows being sold for a farthing, and one of them shall not fall to the ground without your Father, but the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear you not, therefore. You are of more value than many sparrows. So Jesus has already taught us not to fear. In all of this, Jesus is seen as the Lord over all things. His miracles prove this conclusively in his teachings, as well as everything about him. He is the Lord over nature and all of its fury. Have you seen the pictures of the devastation that the hurricanes wrought and the wildfires wrought? It's just astounding, isn't it? Places that just are devastated. And you realize the strength and the magnitude of some of those storms. And I don't know if this was in House to House or where that I read it. It may have been. But I used it, put it in a manuscript I'm writing for a lecture later on next year, just today. I remembered it, and so I made a note of it. There was one area that was just laid bare by one of the hurricanes that came in the last several months. One house was left standing. One house. And people marveled at that. They sought out the man who was responsible, the architect. I built it according to the code. He followed the code of how to build a house that will withstand maybe a Category 5 hurricane. And that house was still standing. Jesus said something about house building, didn't he? Build your house on the rock, not on the sand. He is shown to be Lord over death and all of its stages, demons, and may in that we overcome our fears. Thank you for being here tonight and being a part of our service.